and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. On today's show, we're talking to Bret Schafer from the Alliance for Securing Democracy. They're looking at the way that information has been weaponized in an attempt to potentially disrupt elections and political conversations online. They first started in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, but they're not looking backwards. They're really looking forwards at how we can stop information being used in the way it's currently being used in order to affect the way that political conversations take place, both in real life and online. So we had a really interesting conversation, and I really hope you enjoy it. Before we get started, just a couple of plugs. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this on YouTube if you're listening. You can find us on iTunes. You can get us on Facebook and Twitter, to keep up with what we're doing. And generally, just tell everyone, scream it from the rooftops about you're listening to this podcast. So here's Bret Schafer. So, Bret, it's lovely to have you on the show. Thanks for chatting to us.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So, do you want to just, go over a little bit of what the Alliance for Securing Democracy does before we, dive into some questions?
Yeah. So the Alliance launched, I guess, in July of this year. And the main focus is to look at foreign interference and foreign influence in democratic processes. So that includes elections, but just more generally, democratic organizations and how state actors are trying to manipulate both the information sphere and also just the hybrid war strategy of more direct attacks through cyber, through state economic influence, through energy politics. So this obviously all came about after the 2016 U.S. presidential elections. But we're really more forward thinking instead of trying to go back and look at whether or not collusion happened or the effects of Russian interference on the election. We're trying to figure out ways to ensure that this doesn't happen again and that other state actors don't adopt the techniques that Russia used in 2016.
So what were the techniques? Do you want to go over the different ways in which trolls and bots can be used to shape political conversations online or to attempt to, push things up the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that were involved in 2016. Obviously, you have direct cyber attacks there and hacking. So you look at the John Podesta emails that were leaked and the connection to WikiLeaks there and how they're using information as a weapon. But obviously, the main focus recently has been on what happened on social media. So if you look at both the bot effect, the troll effect, and just how Russia was able to amplify certain messages during the election. And it's also continued. I mean, it's ongoing today. And how they use social media as ways to drive wedges between people, both within the U.S., but also the transatlantic bonds. And we're seeing social media used in a way that's almost the opposite of what it was intended to be, which was this great sort of democratizing tool where everyone had a voice. They're using that to insert sort of some fake news, but we actually don't see a ton of fake news in what we monitor. We see more of just the hyper-partisan news and using those wedge issues to divide us further apart.
That's definitely a really huge part of it because did you see, well, I assume you probably did. If anyone hasn't seen, we'll put a link in the description. The New York Times released a collection of sort of a sample of the adverts that were bought by Russian accounts on Facebook. Yeah. And some of them, so I'd read about the way that they wanted to use this before I saw the ads, and then I saw it and all sort of fell into place for me, in that it's not about picking a candidate and putting loads of money into that candidate. It's about picking issues where emotions run high, and because it's the most efficient way to cause outrage is to attack something really, really hot button and something that people get really passionate about. And you maybe only need like 2, 3, 4 comments to like explode out into, threads that end up having thousands of people like screaming at each other, that was triggered by people who have no skin in the game, for lack of a better phrase. and they jump to each other's defense, and you get this like almost sports team kind of situation built up. And someone actually described the way advertising and targeted ads have been used on Facebook as creating brand loyalty in a way that had never been seen in politics before. And the way they saw people talk about politicians and political issues was kind of almost as if they were talking about their favorite like style of clothing or their favorite like band or something, that they've created these like brands that people identify themselves with and like attach themselves to. Do you think, to what extent do you think that the partisanship and the sort of explosion of polarization has been caused by the use of like bots and trolls, or do you think it's kind of amplified something that was already there, like ripe for the picking?
Yeah, I think it's amplified something that was already there. I think when you look at most of the issues that we see these bots and trolls jump on, they aren't creating these divisions in society. So, I mean, to take it back one step, we operate a site called Hamilton 68. It's a platform that looks at 600 Twitter accounts that are Russian influenced or Russian oriented. So we're able to take kind of a 30,000-foot view of the themes that these Twitter accounts are spreading, both the hashtags, the topics, and the actual URLs that are being shared. So it gives us an overview. So we're able to say and to point out to the public, these are the issues that Russia is using to divide us, or the sort of messaging they're trying to promote in terms of geopolitics. And when you look at those issues, these are things that they would exist whether Kremlin trolls jumped on the bandwagon or not. So for instance, the NFL protests in the US, that's a very divisive topic right now. People have strong opinions on that. And those opinions were going to be formed whether Kremlin trolls were involved or not. But Kremlin trolls got involved, and they got involved in a big way. And they jumped very hard on the further right point of view of what the NFL protests say about America. And they certainly spread that, and they pushed messaging that divided things further. So I think these divisions existed. So it would be unfair to say that they were caused by Russia, but they are certainly attempting to make those divisions worse and to use those divisions also to promote their own point of view on things like Ukraine and Syria, because once they take this hyper-partisan point of view, they gain followers within that network, and they use their platform within a more organic American network to push the points of view they actually care about. Because Russia clearly doesn't care about the NFL.
Yeah.
They have, as you said, no skin in that game. That game is to say, hey, I'm with you. I think this is terrible. Why don't you start following me? We have shared beliefs. And oh, by the way, have you seen that U.S. is working with ISIS in Syria, for example, or ethnic cleansing is happening to Russians in Ukraine? So it's not just that they're doing it just to sow divisions, which is part of it. They're also using those issues to gain a position of influence within a certain population, and to use that position of influence to push narratives that actually are important.
I did want to back up just a tiny bit when you were talking about the sort of different things that Russia has been involved with in terms of the hacking narrative with the DNC. Something I find I don't doubt any of the evidence that, there's been Russian bots on Twitter, on, Russian bot ads on Facebook. There's a lot of shady meetings between members of the Trump campaign before and after the transition with Russian operatives. What I don't like is the fact that the DNC servers still haven't been seen by the FBI, regarding the hack, and that all the evidence we have is just a company that was paid for by the DNC to examine their servers. And I essentially wanted your take on that, because a lot of the narrative got like initially built on the idea of the DNC hacking. And there's quite a lot of techies online who don't think that the hack was possible. And there's a lot more of a debate and a dispute as to whether it was a hack or like an inside leak. I was kind of wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a question that would require someone in intelligence really to answer definitively, and they probably wouldn't be able to answer it definitively publicly. My understanding, what has been released, is that the intelligence community's assessment in the U.S. very strongly, shown is the wrong word, but let's say leans toward Russia having a role in that hack.
Okay.
Again, I'm not a cybersecurity expert, so I'm not the person to say I have the information that proves this beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
But I, from what I have seen of what they have publicly released, that there is fairly strong evidence that Russia was behind that. The nuances of it, of how it was orchestrated, I don't know that. That's just a little bit outside of my area of expertise. But again, my understanding is there is a fair degree of confidence that Russia was involved in that, particularly in the way that the information was then distributed through, Guccifer 2.0, WikiLeaks. Obviously, there has been some suspicion of the connections between Russian intelligence and WikiLeaks. DC Leaks is another one that is a suspicious site in terms of the connections. So I would say the evidence that I have seen, I'm fairly convinced Russia had a part in that. But again, I'm not an expert in that realm.
Yeah, it's just, honestly, what I find more interesting than the fact that there's not been like FBI investigation of the DNC servers is the way that the DNC shut down any like dissent about it. I don't know. I find it a bit odd, but like I'm not saying that it couldn't still be very closely related to Russia or, the rest of the campaign. Like you said, there's obviously ways in which the information was distributed and stuff you can draw from that. But moving on then to sort of how we deal with this.
Yeah.
You'd written a piece, about whether Congress can, legislate or create policy to deal with online misinformation. Where do you think the burden of proof or the burden of truth, lies? The burden of truth. Where do you think it lies in terms of who should be the arbiters of what is true? Like, should it be on the social media platforms where things are being spread about? Should it be the websites that are putting the information out? Should it be the hosts of the websites who are, the people who are providing the servers? Should it be government policy? Should it be us? Like, who should the buck stop with?
I mean, ultimately, I think we are responsible, collectively, for deciding what is truth and what is not. I don't think we want to get in a position where we're putting that burden on just the tech companies, certainly not just the government, because then you're obviously getting into censorship in a way that's not going to be productive at the very least, and obviously, manipulated in the wrong way could really have quite serious consequences if one of those groups is put in charge of deciding what is good information and what is bad information. So I don't think anyone wants that. But I do think that tech companies, hopefully, the hope is the tech companies make some changes, is that, let's say, it's never going to eliminate the problem of fake news or disinformation, but makes it a little less easy to carry out those operations, because ideally, I don't think we want the government involved in that. But if the tech companies don't do anything or don't do enough, the government is going to get involved in it. So that, I think, is the question moving forward of what can tech companies do, not to entirely protect us, because I don't think they should or can have that father figure role of deciding what we should read or what we should see. But at another level, we are seeing the amount of disinformation happening on social media platforms that clearly has had a negative impact in terms of public discourse. And a lot of people are consuming news from websites through social media with no idea of who is behind these news organizations, what their credibility is. So there's been a breakdown of the way consumers traditionally consume news, which is to know where they are getting their news from. So if you take RT, for example, or Sputnik, I mean, at least you know when you read those sites, you're reading a Kremlin-approved point of view. So in that sense,
doesn't mean
you
it's
have
wrong.
Awareness.
It's
right. I mean, you could disagree with what is coming out on RT and Sputnik. Their journalistic practices certainly at times leave a lot to be desired, but at least you know who is behind those. There are a lot of fringy websites now where there's no idea kind of who is behind it, where the money is coming from, if there is a government connection or not. And once you start filtering things through social media, you're getting links to sites where people are consuming news. And this happens on both the left and the right. And they have no idea if this site is credible or not, because they didn't actually seek out that site. It's just showing up in their feed. Half the time, they're probably not even looking at the article. They're looking at these sensationalized headlines. And so there needs to be some level, I think, of the Googles and the Facebooks of the world understanding that just a simple algorithm that is pushing news into people's feeds without taking into account whether or not this site has any credibility, I think that is problematic. Because if you look in the aftermath of the shootings in Las Vegas, for example, in the immediate aftermath, the initial news that was coming out was coming off Reddit feeds. I mean, it was completely not credible. And that was what was being pushed to the top of people's news feeds. And that's a problem. So that's something I think that these sites need to fix. And they obviously need to fix the problem with bots that are artificially amplifying certain narratives in a way that's not normal, which again pushes it into people's news feeds, not because it actually is popular or, let's say, credible or there's any sort of social movement behind it. It's because bots and automated accounts have retweeted it to the point where it has gained a level of, quote unquote, credibility within an algorithm.
It's a really, really difficult place to draw the line. I was honestly kind of curious as to where you thought the line should be drawn for what social media companies should do, because there's a couple of different ways, like each of them have tried to tackle things. And Facebook initially came out and were like, what? No, there's no fake news on our social network. No. And then very quickly rescinded that and started working with fact checkers from like ABC and Snopes and factcheck.com, and now have like a constant cycle of articles being flagged and then fact checked by two separate sources. And if there's something not up, or if there's something up, then they can mark it as disputed. Twitter have been they were kind of of the same opinion. There was like, oh, there's no fake news on Twitter. And then afterwards they were like, well, it's the real time nature of our network that means that, people get fact checked in real time, and the real truth will always make its way to the top eventually. And then YouTube have kind of been like, well, if we don't like your point of view, we're going to demonetize your content and we're going to ban you from YouTube. And even people like I was gobsmacked when Jordan Peterson got banned from YouTube very briefly, because like there's some pretty far right or far left extreme people on YouTube. Jordan Peterson just isn't one of them. He's an incredibly well-read academic. And I thought that was just kind of showed how heavy-handed these measures can be. And essentially, I'm trying to figure out how you reconcile free speech and sort of preventing censorship with this thing called the illusion of truth principle. It's where if someone sees something and they read it, even if they're then told it's untrue, there's still a chance they'll remember the initial false headline or false piece of information as being true. So do you think there's a way we can draw the line anywhere? Or do you think that in drawing a line, it then becomes a slippery slope?
I mean, that's an incredibly important and incredibly difficult question. I don't have an answer yet, for sure. And I don't think anyone really has come up with the answer for that, because this has been a problem way before the internet, way before social media, of the line between free speech and free speech that is considered harmful and who is considering it harmful. That again goes back to the previous question of, should it be tech companies? Should it be the government? Should it be who's regulating it? And once you do that, it's giving someone else too much power over what people can see. But more importantly, perhaps, is if you go out and you label a site, let's say on Facebook, as being not credible, if you take that segment of the population that already has a point of view that mainstream media isn't credible and that they're being lied to, that's probably going to drive them to the sites that are being listed as not credible or disputed. So it might have the, kind of reverse effect of driving people to those sites because they're assuming that it's being regulated because that's where the truth lies. So that's a problem. And then, it just in general it's incredibly tricky, I think, to figure out how you can decide what is truth. And, there are some ways, I think, of coming up with a system that it at least allows people to make informed decisions. I think that's the key right now, is if you get to the thing where you start banning people, that's going to be a real problem. But I think you do need to give people the information and the tools to say, this site has, when it's been fact checked, frequently proven not to be credible. There needs to be more transparency on a lot of websites of, again, who's behind it, sort of what, although even that, as I'm saying that, is challenging because you're talking about authoritarian countries. Of course, you don't want people to have to say, I'm behind this website, that could cause them to be some problems with their own government. So, with each answer, there's sort of a counter argument that could say, this could lead us into some troubled waters. But I think the main thing is important just to have the conversation and have to get to the point where news that's showing up on people's social media feeds isn't just accepted as truth. But again, what companies and what the government can do about it gets very, very tricky. So, it's just going to have to be an ongoing kind of back and forth and push and pull, because you don't want to see things, as you said, with an example that I don't specifically know, but once you put companies or the government in position where they feel like they need to act strongly, probably they're going to lean more towards jumping too far. So we need to, at this point, have this sort of rational argument and back and forth from both sides of the aisle, in particular, of what is a sound practice and what could potentially become problematic very quickly.
What did you make of, just sort of on that topic of where you draw the line, Google? And I think people really underestimate because obviously there's a big debate going on in America. I say now, it seems fairly regular, about net neutrality. Mm-hmm. And something that I've seen some people bring up is like, look, when we get net neutrality nailed down, that should be, we shouldn't be having that conversation. We need to have the conversation about Google neutrality or Facebook neutrality. Because when Google is a search engine that like 80% of the world choose, they have like a kind of responsibility. It becomes less like a product they're providing and more like a public service. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, they've recently decided to sort of de-rank pieces from or parts of Russia Today and Sputnik, which, if it goes to a problem that we actually talked about with Bret Weinstein, who's a former Evergreen State professor, and he was concerned about how you label something as fake news or junk news, in that, yes, Russia Today and Sputnik are Russian state-approved pieces of news, right? But that doesn't mean that there's not legitimate people on these networks, like making a point that they couldn't make elsewhere. Like, so in the UK, we have a couple of different, shows. There's Max Kaiser, there's, Alex Salmond, that they're like ex-politicians and really like, well, maybe not respected because of the outlet they've had to go to, but they're fairly credible pundits and names. And I'm really honestly curious as to see whether this is a trend that continues, whether this is like a backlash against the sort of Russian hacking, and Russian interference in election narratives, or whether this is something that will be continued to the point where they can go, okay, you know, Fox News, for example, in America, you're going to be deranked until your quality of reporting comes up. CNN, you're going to be deranked until your quality of reporting comes up. But because they're still providing, like, because they have the resources of a large cable network, they're still providing, like, there's still good people on those networks. So I guess my question is, like, what do you think the consequences are going to be of that sort of thinking?
Right. I mean, I think if you go back, it's easy to derank RT because of its direct connection to the Kremlin.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of problems with RT. I'm certainly not a person to defend RT or Sputnik. But to your point, you know, once you make the jump from RT, who, okay, it's Kremlin connected, that's maybe a low-hanging fruit of a cable network, to then maybe saying, well, should Breitbart be next? Or, you know, take an extreme left outlet. That does get into the slippery slope thing. But also, to your first point of, you know, I think for a long time, these platforms, Google and the social media companies, like to present publicly a view of themselves as just being pipes that information crosses through. And, you know, they don't have a role. They don't want to get into the game of deciding what people read or what they see. But with their algorithms, they've been in that game. So that argument doesn't necessarily hold up in terms of, hey, we don't have a say in what people see. We don't want to be the sort of arbiter of what people are able to share. But of course, you know, as everyone knows, when you log on to Facebook, you are seeing a curated bit of news based on what you've searched for. So I do think they have some responsibility there in terms of, you know, particularly when you talk about the ads, which are also, you know, as I pointed out, probably low-hanging fruits because those have been bought for a specific purpose. They're making money off of them. It's not just, that's not free speech in the same way of just regulating which outlets you're able to look at, or an individual person, let's say on Twitter, who has some borderline views. If they start banning them, it all gets very problematic and very tricky very quickly. But again, you know, so I don't accept the tech companies' position that they shouldn't be involved because they don't want to get into the game of deciding what people can and can't read, because they already do that.
Yeah.
You know, I do think they need to do a better job of that, or again, at least in some way, figure out ways that their system is not being gamed by bots, or that they're showing fake news that clearly is inflammatory and wrong. But as soon as you start doing that, you know, as you brought up, it could go down the wrong path very quickly. So it's a challenge. I don't think there is an easy answer to that.
What? No. Obviously there's like some pretty big theoretical questions that we're working around in trying to figure out people's relationship with facts and truth. And something I actually try and stick to is there's a guy who does like debunking of urban legends and sort of online conspiracies and stuff. And he said that the way he likes to talk to, for example, people who believe the earth is flat, is to try and bring them back to a principle of ground truth. So that it's something that's like, look, we can all agree on this thing. This is real. You can't say this is fake. This is happening. Like, I'm going to put this in front of you. and you kind of have to build from there. And I think something that personally I feel is important is providing people with the skills to identify that growing truth.
Yeah.
At a young
Absolutely.
age.
Yeah, no, we've talked a lot about importance of media literacy training starting at a younger age. Although, of course, one of the big problems right now is if you look at who's most susceptible to fake news, it tends to be older generations who are online and don't have some of those basic skills that millennials do because they grew up with the technology. So they're just used to things like photoshopping or just the kind of being able to look at a website and say, this doesn't look right. This doesn't actually look like a credible newspaper because of this reason or that reason. So I think younger generations, in a sense, inherently have a better BS detector online than older generations. And not that there's a direct correlation here, but if you look at the rise of fake news online, it happened around a time when actually a lot of people over the age of 50 who didn't grow up with technology got onto social media. So in 2000, I'm going to totally screw up these statistics, but in 2008, let's say 20% of people over the age of 50 were on Facebook. Now it's 65%. And this is more anecdotal, but for the most part, when I've seen, really kind of some outlandish stuff being spread around networks, it's happening not with a younger generation who's able to say that's photoshopped. That's from 4 years ago. This site clearly is a fake news site. So when you're talking about the need for media literacy training, yes, I absolutely agree. But it's like, how do you train that generation that's already out of school, that you don't really have an ability to educate at the same level? Because this is happening across generations for sure.
I think I think that perhaps the reason that people of an older generation will go online and just sort of believe what they read is because there was never so much talk of the fake news media. Right. Or like, people maybe understood that some outlets were biased, but the news was generally believed. Like, it was on TV, it was happening. So if you see a video of it, like it's TV on your phone. So, there's a video of that must have happened. Or, if it was in the newspapers, it had like a certain standard to be held to in terms of like a press regulator. So they just, because people aren't familiar with the ins and outs of, what the press regulator did and, their effect upon the thing, they just expected that people who were writing the news were trustworthy. And someone's sent me an email, like it's like the Nigerian prince email.
Right.
And I never quite understood why people sort of bought everything. They like how people fell for these sorts of phishing scams sometimes. But it used to baffle me because, like, if someone came down, like if you were walking down the street and someone came up to you and went, "I am your bank. Give me your details, because we got to sort something out," or your PayPal needs you to log in on this bit of paper right here, sign away. And you'd be like, I'd be like, no, go away. But when it's online, it suddenly has this like air of legitimacy. And I'm guilty of reading things and being like, geez, is that true? And then having to go and Google it and be like, oh, that must have been absolute bullshit.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think that is the point. You have the skills to go and Google it and to do a bit of investigative research of your own. I don't know if that's even the right term, but to do at least some background. Like, this doesn't seem right. And go in and dig into it a little further, which I think a lot of people who are just scrolling through news on their phones, they're seeing that first thing and not doing that second level of, I should probably look into this because this seems a little bit crazy. But I mean, going back to your first, I mean, even growing up in the 80s, I mean, the news was just the news. I don't remember ever looking at things even, we didn't even have CNN and Fox News then. So you didn't even have this sort of partisan cable news channels where you started not believing what you were hearing on the other side, depending on how your politics broke down. I mean, if you read it in the newspaper, it was more or less fact. Unless, of course, it was the time they got it wrong and that they would say they got it wrong. That's the difference now with a lot of these sites is there's not, say what you will about Fox and CNN and Washington Post or any of these things that get attacked by different political parties in the U.S. They still have sort of basic standards of journalistic ethics where you can totally disagree with the editorial bent they're putting on things, but they're not fake news. They're not fabricating things in ways that other sites can do and get away with even when they're called out on it because there's nobody to shut them down. And again, I'm not saying that in the sense of we need regulators to start shutting down things, but there's no editor-in-chief there who's going to say, if you run a story that proves to be completely false, you're out of a job. Now, in a sense, that's sort of, it's promoted on a lot of these sites. And, when we go back to that thing again of the older generation who was used to just believing what they read, I don't think it's conceivable to them when they see something on a site called U.S. News Source that it's being written by a 22-year-old in Macedonia who's just doing it for clicks and has it just doesn't care at all whether or not the story holds up because it's monetizing clicks and they understand that sensationalized things get more clicks and their sort of journalistic standards don't mean anything. So I think with what's happened in the last year, that's probably it's entering public conversation more. So I think you'll see less of people just believing everything they've seen online. But again, I think it's a long process.
I think it's another difficult line to walk. I would like to say that the problem with Fox isn't that they're presenting an opinion. It's that opinion is presented as news. And it's very much the same with a lot of cable networks in that people can't quite tell when to draw the line between like what's Sean Hannity's spin on the latest event and what's actually happened in the latest event. And that is a lot of the time where the issue comes from. Because, I'm all for people wanting to be able to say what they want. But, be honest about it. This isn't the truth of the matter.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at most cable news now in the US context, at least, I mean, 70% of it almost are people shouting each other on panels. I mean, you could watch hours of cable news and learn nothing other than the extreme positions of whoever they've gotten on there, basically to create a fight because that's good television. But it's bad news. So this sort of infotainment environment that's been created, and Fox was the first, but unfortunately now a lot of the others have attempted to basically replicate Fox, but by taking different points of view on the political spectrum. And you end up with these news channels where, frankly, a lot of the time, news is not at the core of what they're doing anymore. And differentiating between the sort of screaming panels and straight news that are giving you facts that you can't, this is what happened. That division is becoming more and more blurred. And that's a real problem because then you have people who just don't believe anything. For example, I don't know what kind of coverage this has gotten in the UK, but the Roy Moore scandal in the US.
I don't know how much I honestly don't know how much has been covered by the British press. If I'm talking about American news, I don't tend to trust the British press. I like to go and read, Vox or something like that. But
yeah. So just to kind of touch on it briefly, Roy Moore is the senatorial candidate from Alabama, who is a very conservative Republican, and several women came out with allegations against him for sexual misconduct. I mean, more than that, basically saying he sexually assaulted them when they were minors. Some pretty extreme stuff. But the fact that that came out in the Washington Post, which for conservative Republicans is seen as just this sort of liberal rag that's out to push a Democratic agenda. When pollsters went to Alabama and asked people if they believed the allegations, it was something like 70+% thought that they were completely made up, even though that Washington Post's reporting has, I mean, the reporting at least has been basically proven to be credible because that organization has been portrayed and has taken a harder left stance. Anything that they put out is seen as propaganda, not to be believed. So in a sense, it has almost, again, the reverse effect of if they publish something negative, it's seen as this sort of orchestrated attack. And there's just been this breakdown of this is believable news. You can't contest what's here, because everything now has just become a partisan news source of some sort, at least in most people's point of view.
Yeah, there's a couple of things on that. I am amazed every day that sexual assault and pedophilia has become partisan. Like, it's happening in the UK as well at the minute. There's some allegations about senior members of our cabinet, and they're being written off as, you know, partisan attacks. And I am just, because in every other industry, whether that's in Hollywood, in media, in Fox News, like with Bill O'Reilly. There was like an NPR editor. I'm pretty sure there was a New York Times editor. Both had to resign or were sacked. Every single industry and part of society is making the call to go, this isn't on. And yet in politics, they've managed to make it a partisan issue. But the Washington Post, the really, really shocking thing about that is the fact that there was a fake story propagated by Project Veritas to try and throw the Washington Post, and the Washington Post did a counter sting operation, reporting on the people who were trying to feed them a false story, and they still weren't believed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, but that's unfortunately the kind of environment that has been built up where there's just such deep mistrust of the quote unquote mainstream news that's also what's driving people to believe what they're seeing on these just very fringe sites where you don't even know who the reporters are, because they don't trust what's coming out in the mainstream so much that they're more likely to trust something completely out of that world, despite the fact that they have no background whatsoever into who's running it, who the reporter is, what their agenda might be. So that it's a real problem just in general when we're talking about disinformation and fake news and what Russia is doing. I mean, a lot of what Russia is able to do in terms of manipulating the information sphere is because people don't believe what they're reading or seeing on television. Like, again, I'm going to misquote the exact statistics, but in 1975, 73% of people believed or trusted the media in the U.S. Today, it's at about 30%, and among Republicans, it's about 14%. That's a real problem when what should be the credible news is not believed, because then people want information from somewhere. They're going to go somewhere else, and they're going to go to places that aren't going to hold up to the journalistic standards we talked about. So, when we talk about the Kremlin's role in all of this, yes, again, they certainly have taken advantage of it, but a lot of the problems are problems that are starting at home that need to be dealt with in various industries, and also just certainly among kind of just the partisanness in politics that is, it's just become toxic.
I couldn't agree more. So just to finish off then, where do we go from here? Like, what does the future hold for us?
Yeah. That's the question. I think there's been a lot of soul searching in this last year, with the Trump presidency, even among people on the right who are pro-Trump. It seems like there's sort of a moment of national reckoning of where we are and where we're going. And the hope is that we kind of hit pause and take a look at what's going on and try to reel things back in and, make our traditional news better and stronger and invest more in local media. I mean, that's also a big problem, is because local media is not the entire economics behind it is just broken down. So you have communities that don't have a local newspaper anymore, or that has a local newspaper that basically, it's a shell of what it was. So they have no connection to where their news is coming from. So, where is news profitable? It's profitable with clickbait news online. So that's one, is we need to have this kind of conversation of how do we get back to news that can be trusted, and how do we, finance news? The internet obviously broke everything down in terms of the traditional way we pay for information. So how do we kind of figure out where we're paying for news, how we're getting news, and more generally, just the kind of conversations that we're having with each other and how we're viewing things. And again, my hope, if I'm being optimistic, is people are going to look at what's happening right now and see a real problem. And the steps they're going to take are going back to how do we fix this in terms of making it better, as opposed to more extreme, hyper-partisan sniping at each other that just continues to, if you take a crack that's turning it into a chasm right now, and it's getting just deeper and deeper and deeper, and you say, all of these problems that are happening are because of the people on the far right, or vice versa. It's the same thing in Europe, obviously. We track the kind of messaging happening there. It's the people who allowed the migrants to come in, and migrant crime, and they're destroying Christianity in Europe. If we take those extreme views, it's going to get worse quickly. So we need to get public figures, and we need to have people in the media who bring us back somehow into the center. Because if we kind of stake out a position on one extreme here, it's going to keep getting worse.
Well, that's quite the endorsement for radicalcentrism there.
Yeah, it is. And I've been thinking about this the other day. That sort of the courage today is to take a centrist position, where you all, it used to be, take a stand, but really it is now that it seems to take more courage to not take an extreme point of view. Those are applauded. Even, when you look at some of the comments that were made on the campaign trail, they're done for applause lines within a very specific population, but it obviously just divides that population from everyone else further. So our politicians, the media in general, need to somehow figure out a way to kind of steer it back. Drifting it further apart is not helping anyone.
No. Well, on that note, hopefully we can all try and have better conversations and, be a little bit more objective in our day-to-day lives. But
absolutely.
We will stick links for all your stuff in the description.
Great.
Anything you need to, mention, or anything you want to get in here before we?
No, just sort of, I guess, as a last thought, going back to the concept of truth and how difficult it is to come up with objective truth. But I do think there is something still called objective truth. And what the Kremlin was able to do within Russia, having spent time there, is poison the idea of there being objective truth. And that maybe is the most dangerous thing or most effective thing that they were able to do domestically. And that would be the most dangerous thing they could do in Europe or the United States, is where people, Margarita Simonyan, the RT editor, has said there is no such thing as objective truth. There's just points of view. There is something called objective truth, and we need to get back to understanding that and to starting from the objective truth. Then you can have your editorializing, your points of view, but starting from a basis of truth does exist. It's not all spin. So how do we get back to that as being at least the bedrock of, our democratic society? Because if we're just taking points of view, that's going to be a problem.
I couldn't agree more. It's going to be a roller coaster ride while we try and figure this out as a society and a species.
Absolutely.
But thanks very much for chatting to us. It's been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed it. I could have gone on for hours.
Thank you. No, this was fun.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to share us on social media, subscribe to the podcast wherever you find your podcasts, whether that's iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and, generally spread the word. Later in the week, we have an interview with David Clark from Positive Money, so I'm really excited for you guys to hear that. So tune in if you don't want to miss that. Until next time, thanks for listening.